Hello, everyone. Welcome to panel number 5, History at the Table. How are y'all doing today? You're all good?
Doing good.
Now that Zoom is finally cooperating with me, yes.
Fight it.
I just realized I should have grabbed my beer stein to have my pop in for this panel because I've been kidding.
I just have my nice, lovely D20 mug, courtesy of Robin.
I kept looking around for props.
I kept coffee, in fact.
I kept looking around for props and being like, nothing I have will fit in the screen.
Yeah,
Never
I'm
mind.
Go get my stein real quick because
that sounds good.
Yeah.
I think if I have anything in particular, I just have a whole bunch of history books on a bookshelf to the side of me. That's not very visible by where I sit, because in the Pacific Northwest, you do not actually want to sit with a bookshelf behind you. Because when an earthquake hits, which they will hit,
when it does, yeah.
it will land on your head.
All right,
Wait,
so sitting with a bookshelf behind you is a bad idea in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
It's all fine. So, folks, this is History at the Table, the panel where a bunch of historians, surprise, we're academics, will sit around and talk about history and how you can incorporate it into your tabletop role-playing games. I'll start off as the host of this panel. I'm Kelly. This is Dork Tales, which is my channel. I use he and him as my pronouns. And my background is, I have, so bringing to the table, I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Writing for Stage and Screen, a bachelor's degree in classics with a focus on mythology. I have a bachelor's degree in American history and a Master of Arts in public history, particularly a focus on interactions between humanity and media. And how media influences human culture and human thought processes. Particularly my master's focus was on nuclear warfare, which is something I actually don't like, but I ended up doing it because I got really interested thanks to my supervisor in my master's. So that's me. I am also a former professor of visual storytelling. So that's my background. Putting my BDE in here, my big debt energy.
Or big degree energy.
Big degree energy, yeah. I actually was driving home the other day and I'm like, do I have 5 degrees or 4 degrees? Because I got one by accident. So
that's always fun, the accidental ones.
Because Jen, you have an accidental degree, don't you?
I have several.
Right? Oh, here comes the shame. It's great. So let's pass it around. So Christine, let's go with you next.
All right. Well, I'm Christine. I use she, her pronouns, and I have a bachelor's degree in arts, in history, with a minor in anthropology. My history degree focused on British history prior to about 17th, long 18th century.
Nice. All right, let's pass down to Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen, and I use she, her pronouns. And let's see, I have a
here we go.
A bachelor's degree in classics, a bachelor's degree in linguistics with a minor in English, a diploma of library and information technology, a certificate in computer information systems, which is my accidental one. Accidental on purpose. I needed more classes, so I just decided to get another thing. And I'm actually starting my Master's of Information Management on Monday. So, good times.
Right. And for the chat asking how you get an accidental degree, it's kind of like what Jen just said. You sign up for extra classes. When I went to university in Canada, you have to name your major when you're going in, right, for study visa purposes. So I just picked a department and they accepted me, which was the classics department. It's like, I don't know, I'm writing a novel I'm still writing that same damn novel that involves like classics stuff. So I'll just do this to get some research and I'll pick a better major later. And then I just kept taking classes until I was like, oh, I'm like 3 classes away from a second degree when I got my writing degree. I'm like, okay, fine. Let's just do it.
Yeah, I started university as a writing major, and then went and started doing classics classes. And actually this goes into the thing we were talking about before stream started, where I have a lot of very, very specific knowledge and not a lot of general knowledge because of things like the university would not let me take the general classics class. So the way our university structured the degree was you had to do 3 credits, which was a full year. It was 2 semesters, 3 credits worth of first year courses. It didn't name them. It just said first year courses. And then 3 credits of second year courses, and then a bunch of credits of third and fourth year courses. Before I decided I was going to get a classics degree, where I learned I would have to do that 3 credits of first year courses, I had taken third and fourth year courses because they didn't have prerequisites. Then the system was like, you already did this, you can't take level 100, which is the only first year class in the classics department.
Oh, I remember this story now.
Yeah, right. So they so instead, because apparently the system wouldn't let me do it and they wouldn't put me in it for some reason, so every other third and fourth year class that had GRS 100 as the prerequisite, I had to ask the professor for permission to take the class and just be like, look, dudes, here. For my first year credits, I got Latin, as I took 2 semesters of Latin, which counted, but that's not general classic stuff. So I have none. I have all of the, like, I took an entire class on the history of Nero's reign. That was the whole class.
Well, you know what's really funny about this, Jen?
Mhm.
So I work for the university that Jen attended, and I know full well they could have fixed that issue
Oh yeah,
very easily by putting a fucking override in the system.
It's
Yep.
true. Well,
It is
Absolutely.
possible. It is completely 100% possible. I know because I've done those.
well, before we go too much further, hi, Robin.
Yes.
Hi. just patiently waiting.
You're so
yes.
patient. It's admirable.
Thank you.
Really
But yes, hello everyone. I'm Robin. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, and I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Enology and Viticulture, which is fancy words for winemaking and grape growing. And I've almost accidental degrees. I think I was 2 or 3 courses off from also getting a minor in geography, but I just couldn't be bothered at the time. And then for my undergrad thesis, I apparently did enough work in 8 months to get a master's at that level, but the university obviously wouldn't do that because I didn't have any of the courses. But apparently I did a master's level thesis inside of an undergrad thesis for not really to do with history, but the effects of red wine making techniques to increase tannin in cool climate regions in Canada. But yeah, I have taken a lot of wine history courses, and specifically a lot in Canada, but also like generally how we grew grapes in different parts of the world during different periods in history, and how it affects our cultures, and how drinking is a huge impact on cultures, especially when we're like, we'll get into it more, but like the Romans and winemaking is one of the biggest like ways that the wine industry spread in Europe was because of the Romans. So we have to thank the Romans for that.
You're welcome. All right, so folks, ooh, wow, I shouldn't have used that emoji. I just released bees into the chat, and they showed up on the screen, which is great.
Oh gosh.
I love this. I love the emo explosions. So, folks, today we're going to talk about a ton of history stuff. We've all got our periods that we're particularly good with, and Robin is kind of the generalist on this because you know a lot about alcohol and its development forever, right? So, and alcohol, of course, being useful as one of the first safe ways to drink water, or to hydrate yourself is to drink like watered down wine, right? Or just straight up wine.
Basically just low alcohol wine. The sugar content wasn't high enough from local like fruits and berries and beer, but it was fermented and sterilized. So
I have to ask you a question. So this is something that comes up in every D&D game at the very least. And what it tends to be is, we go to the tavern, do you have any water? Or people like say, oh, you can't drink water here, so you have to drink like wine or beer or something like that. And then people immediately go to I'm so drunk because all we can drink is wine, right? Like that's how people roleplay this because they round it up. What percentage are we talking about? Like how much wine would, say, like if we're going like biblical, right?
So biblical wine, so for now, if like, okay, if you're comparing to wine of like today, white wines can range between, and again, this changes throughout history. It's really interesting to see how what's the word I'm looking for? trends. There we go. The trends change because sorry, I'm a little tired waking up. But how people's alcohol consumption changes throughout different periods of time, because for a while the trend for winemaking was having these super intense high alcohol whites and reds. So you'd find like white wines at 12-13% and reds at like 15-16% alcohol. And now actually the trend is actually doing lower percent alcohol wines because you can drink more and you don't necessarily get drunk super fast. So now it's like whites will usually be between 9 and 11%, and reds kind of are 13 to 15 at the very max, which is really interesting to see how that affects. And it's a challenge now with winemakers because our climate's getting hotter, and with ripeness and sugar, because sugar plus yeast equal your alcohol content and produce ethanol. Quick winemaking lesson and beer making. So the hotter the grapes get before you harvest them, the more sugar, the more ethanol you can produce in a wine. But so that's like kind of how today's alcohol percentage was in like biblical times, and like we're talking like 4000 BC kind of thing. Potentially they found like traces of wine. You're probably thinking like 3 to 4%.
Oh, so like literally like having a glass of wine's like cracking like a Miller Lite or some like
flavored water.
Even less. It is.
Oh yeah, crap! I'm thinking Canadian beers.
Yeah.
Oh my god. So like, that's okay.
It's so minimal that like you would have to put in a concerted effort to get drunk. It was a method that they found that you could have sterilized water and be able to drink this without worrying about getting diseases like cholera, E. coli, all those diseases that you'd get from drinking stale, stagnant water or infected water from like an animal upstream or something like that. And so fermentation was found to use this great way of making a safe, potable liquid to drink. And yeah, you could get drunk, but by the amount that you would consume over, going into the pub, you'd have to drink a lot in a short amount of time to feel buzz. But then, like, especially with like beer, the wheat in it, you'd get more full than actually drunk, because it has that the hops and wheat and barley, those would fill you up more than having the alcohol. So it's a quite a low level.
Actually, I've heard about that like the pyramid builders and like Egyptian workers had breakfast beer, and it was like, oh yeah, breakfast beer, crack it up. It's like, well, it was more like drinking oatmeal than anything. It was like fermented oatmeal, and yeah it was a carbo load for the day. But so what I want to ask to pop out of this pocket, we're all gamers. We love games. You can all see everybody here in our Made to the Ascension, the Victorian era game, which starts again next Saturday, which you should definitely join us in. What is something about history you wish people knew, particularly for games? Like when you watch a game, when you play a game, like what's your, well, actually moment?
It really depends.
So do you have one?
Well, okay, so on the previous topic of beer and wine and whatnot, you will find, if you actually look up anything to do with like 17th, 18th, like and earlier centuries, especially British, which, I mean, a lot of the historical writing is British or French or whatnot, because they were prolific and they were an empire for a reason at the time. You'll find lots of references to small beer and stuff like that, and that's what they drank, and it was basically beer. It was just not the way we do it. Like, it was a fermented drink, but it was, I think, closer to the lines of, honestly, like, say kombucha as a fermented drink than anything else. So it's making the water safe, it's flavored, it has like a lot more nutrients in it, so it's actually healthy for you. But you'll read all these things, and kind of the first implication, because it's beer and what we think of as beer, it's kind of horrifying at first. And people, like, I've seen lots of comment sections on stuff where people are freaking out of, oh, they were so awful, they fed their children beer. I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake. I'm not getting in an argument with you. You're too stupid. No. Go look it up and
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
beer. It's not the beer that we have today.
It's not like just because it was called beer doesn't mean that we haven't changed that word.
Yeah.
That word
Well,
meant something different.
See, this is where I wish we had Amy,
200
one of our
years
other
ago.
mage players, in here because she's a linguist, and we could talk about the way that words evolve, like beer, or what are some other really good ones?
Like the-
Corn.
Like the process essentially remained the same.
Yeah.
But we refined it and made it much better and more alcoholic and that sort of stuff and much more controlled.
And
But
more efficient.
everybody made their own, like, for the most part, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's what a
There's-
cook did.
Yeah, there's also another aspect, just because we were on the beer topic, so it fits in nicely. But there's the whole idea of like festival beers, and how normally, because festivals would often start in the evening after a long day of work, those beers were designed to keep you up. They were designed to keep you like going, rather than making you all sleepy and stuff. And that I don't know exactly what the addition was, but I've heard that the church is actually the ones who were like, let's dial down this beer a bit and make people sleepy so that they're not partying all the time.
Right. And the thing is, like, a lot of things change over time. So Chandra in the chat just posted that that their actually moment is height in the Old West, like a 6 foot tall average height in the Old West. I have, okay, so here's one. I want to ask everybody who's big into history, what's the average lifespan, or what's the typical lifespan of someone who died from old age in classic Greece or Rome?
Like 70s normal.
Yeah. Everybody's like,
Yeah.
oh, the average age, like the typical age you live to be like 30. Yeah, if you
No.
got stabbed.
Yes.
It's
Which was
just
more
it's
common.
offset by
a
all the
problem
children
with
dying.
statistics.
So
Because you've lumped them all together. If you survive to 10 years old, you're probably going to live to old age. Congratulations.
get
unless
stabbed.
you die in a war, in which
Yeah.
case, and some of the things when you're learning about the ancient world that stagger the mind is that you look at like movies like Lord of the Rings, you look at like any type of fantasy epic, Kingdom of Heaven, and you're like, oh, there's a lot of people on the battlefield. They've got like 10,000 troops like fighting here, and then the ancient historians are like, we had a battle with Persia that had 1 million men on the field last week. We populations were surprisingly large back then. They because people didn't really have TV, so they had a couple things to do, and one of them was make kids. Also, you had to breed constantly because kids died really easily. I took a class for my history degree about. Or no, I took this one for fun back when I was doing writing. Death and dying in Victorian England. And Christine, you know about this one because you took the same course, and it's the child mortality rates up into the Victorian era, and slightly before it by pig. Pigs would eat your babies. There is constantly on censuses. Okay, a pig will eat anything?
Yeah.
Yes.
I know that.
Most
yes,
sayings have truth behind them. Like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's because you could have.
Yeah, because you were literally throwing the bathwater out the window.
Well, and also, but the fact that a bath would go through your entire family. Starting with dad. Dad was most important. Dad got it first. Then mom. Then the oldest kids. And then the youngest kids. Then the baby got washed in the filthy water. But the water is so cloudy and hard to see through at this point that you could, literally, if you weren't paying attention, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because they would be invisible in there.
That's yikes.
Like that's literally a possibility. If you're just doing that parent thing of you're exhausted, you work full time in that period, which is dawn to dusk, and then you have to work full time at your home stuff and dealing with all the other kids, and you're doing baths by candlelight as well, which also you have to think candlelight then versus now. Our candles would have been so expensive back then. What they actually had, for the most part, for poor people or even mid-class people, was tallow dips or rush lights, which are literally a piece of like rush dipped in tallow and then burnt. And it it generally balances on a thing, which is where you get the thing of burning the candle from both ends.
Oh.
So yeah, and it's like there's so much in history that you got to like, you don't have to pay attention to it. We use a lot of history at our table because we're nerds. And like in our Victorian era game, like I actually think that our Victorian era game is a really good example of how we do history here, because I think the number one thing at doing history at the table is you hand wave it if it's not fun. Right? Like, if you're ever playing a game and people are expecting you to speak in period dialect, they're idiots. Don't listen to them. Nobody knows what period dialect truly sounded like unless we recorded it on like a gramophone or something like that. Go back and watch the movie Gangs of New York and watch some of the performances there, because the accents are actually recreated by professional linguists and historians.
I would argue a little bit about we don't know.
Fine, we do, but you can't expect people to emulate.
No, you can't expect regular people. There are people who do research into like original pronunciation, OP is Shakespeare type pronunciation. There's also the
which is much more Scottish, right? I hear that. I've heard a rumor, Jen, that like one of the best ways to do Shakespeare is actually in Appalachian English. Oh, thank you so much, Bunny Arden.
Appalachian being...
So like dangle down in the South, yo, like that kind of like heavy Southern is actually closer to what English was back then.
American accents closer to what English was back then, because they came over and they changed in their way, and then England changed in a whole bunch of other ways. And that's the beautiful thing about geographical dialects and stuff and linguistics.
Also, there's no one English accent.
Yeah.
They're very regional for a very small area.
Yeah.
Which you will immediately find out if you ever play with anyone from the UK.
Yes.
I like when we did Victorian, we immediately had a good friend of the channel actually was giving Robin like Irish accent tips. Oh, you're too northern. Like you need to move it, and Ireland's this big, like on a map. Like it's this big in person. Right?
Yeah, from where I said that Darcy was, and her accent was like, "Oh, you're a little bit too different." I'm like, I'm
sorry that you have 6 different ways of speaking in a 2-block radius. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Literally.
Sorry, Jen.
No, it's fine.
Rip me apart for the language.
I was going to move on to a different topic, so it's fine. We want to keep talking language. I just remembered my major, moment with history, and that's studded leather armor doesn't exist.
Okay, why not? Tell me why it doesn't exist.
Because if you put studs in your leather armor, it ruins it and it makes it less effective.
Wouldn't studded leather armor just mean that you have built-in shrapnel when you get hit with a hammer? No,
but
okay.
Also, anyways, studs generally are very small, and it wouldn't actually give you any benefit besides just heavy leather.
And it would just put metal that like right on your body that people are hitting you, points of metal in your body.
That's what I meant with the hammer. Like it'd just be like bam, oof.
But that hurts you more than them.
No. Also, it was shrapnel for you.
Oh yes.
Would think studs would be harder to clean and thus more easily rusting inside the leather, where they're getting sweaty and it's being held against it.
Yep. And as Chad has mentioned, it puts holes in your armor and it tears easier.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're just destroying the integrity of the leather.
Speaking of leather, I think the funniest thing that I've ever seen is in the game Ultimate Werewolf, which is the card game, like the social drama game, the social deduction game. There's an expansion where you can be the tanner of the village, and the tanner wins the game if he dies because his life is that bad. Which is just really funny historically because of the chemicals and rendering leather and like doing tallow work is not pleasant from what I understand. Jen, can you confirm?
Yeah.
Modern methods are much better, but historically, there's a reason tanners were always outside the city walls for the most part.
And you've ever met a guy named Tanner?
Also, when you're thinking about like jobs and stuff in those sort of times, you've got to think, okay, what was your sanitation system? And if it's a hole in the ground, well, that fills up eventually.
Yep.
What happens then?
You poop in the river, obviously.
There were people like that who had to do those jobs. They dug them out. They were called night soil men too, in Victorian times, where they collected the chamber pot contents.
Also known as the poopsmith.
Because you got to think, if you're pooping in a chamber pot, well, your maid takes it away in the morning. What's she do with it?
That being said, there were
Your
some
urine
really
was used for cleaning, though.
there were some really elaborate toilets or toilet-like fixtures. There are some great ones I've seen in castle diagrams that are basically like window boxes for royalty that just have a hole at the bottom of them, so they literally shit down the side of their own castle.
Yes.
Usually into the moat, I think, right?
Well, and actually, okay, so speaking of that, in really hard to say British or Scottish castles,
We're talking about
some
poop.
of them you can go to and you can see the old staining on the wall. If you know what you're looking at, you can see where it has degraded the stone because it'll run down the castle wall, and that will stink, by the way. But
Oh, like the stone will still stink?
no.
Okay.
200, 300 years later. It's washed away by now.
It's a royal decree.
But that is one of my big pet peeves, is that people think that historical people stank all the time. It's not
Especially
actually true.
Vikings. Vikings were clean as
Vikings
hell.
were super clean.
But they think that because they didn't bathe, they were dirty. And that's not true. Because what they did was they wore linen next to their skin, which is a natural fiber. And they washed that daily. And they changed that daily. And they bleached and sun bleached and worked the hell out of that cloth.
Yeah.
Like, I can't remember the exact saying, but it's something like, there's a reason why pure white is considered next to godliness, because it's cleanliness.
Yeah.
The whiter your linen, the cleaner you were.
Yeah.
And whatnot. And also, like, hair now, if you go a couple days without washing and don't put any product in, your hair's going to be greasy. However, what they would do is they had it tied up quite often. It was braided, it was under something, it was under linen, it was under natural fiber, which would help suck some of the moisture out. They would brush it very carefully, constantly, like very long, which would distribute everything across. So actually, for the most part, they weren't that dirty. They might not smell the way we expect people to smell nowadays, but they still had herbs and flowers and ointments and perfumes.
They probably scrubbed certain stinky bits with a rag or something too, right? Like, oh, your underarm stinks, wipe it off.
Well, you would wipe yourself down with linen. Like, you're not necessarily washing, and also you'd be washing your face and your hands. You'd have your basin of water in the morning and you'd wash. You just wouldn't be getting yourself soaking.
Because that's decadent, right? Like that's
decadent.
That's a lot of water.
But B, also unhealthy. Because you've got to remember they had to have fires to keep everything warm. They didn't have central heating. So your bedroom would be effing cold unless you were really rich and could afford to have servants constantly tending the fires, which is also dangerous.
Yeah, because one of the huge ways that you would die, particularly in the classical world, is by fire, because everything was built of wood, not good wood. And also, it was like, if you've seen any pictures from...
Why London burned down.
Why Rome burned down a few times. Yeah, by any old city burned down constantly. Because of the wood, and likely because people were crammed in so much. If you've ever seen pictures of Kowloon Walled City, a lot of ancient Rome kind of had that population density of tenement buildings where you had like three families do an apartment in some of the poor areas. Like, immigrants would come in from outside, they'd move in and they'd be stuck in these tenements, and then they'd get lit on fire, which is my favorite thing in the world, because Jen, what were you not allowed to carry inside of the walls of Rome?
I don't remember.
Oh, it's been a while. So you weren't
haven't done general knowledge.
Oh God! So you weren't allowed to carry weapons. You weren't allowed to carry, like, obviously you'd have a knife, like a small knife for like eating in general. Like, basically, like, think about like the old 4-inch rule. Like, you can carry a 4-inch utility blade. You could do stuff like that, but anything bigger than a knife was not allowed inside of Rome for the majority of its existence, except a very special class of people called the Vigilantes. Vigilantes, which is where we get the term, were hired by the emperor, or by the powers that be, to walk around with axes in case of fires, to hack down doors and things. Now, what happens when you get a unionized group of people allowed to carry weapons in a no-weapon zone? They got hired for other stuff too, and then there's like, oh, the place was on fire when we got here. And he was hacked up. It was weird. I think the pig did it.
To go back to like the washing, and especially with hair and stuff, they do say that these days a lot of people wash their hair too much. It is a very personal thing based on your own like hair oils and whatnot, but
Or how much you diet.
yeah, and that. But the idea of washing your hair every day can be harmful to some people's heads, and so the fact that they didn't necessarily do that, it doesn't mean that they were dirty, right?
Wasn't that a reason that a lot of us have dandruff, is that we dry our scalps out by not allowing natural oils to replenish?
Probably, yeah.
I think
Like,
so.
it's-
Yeah, I think I remember my
Yeah, you
aunt,
actually
who's a
don't hear-
hairdresser.
When you're reading like historical sources for, say, Regency period or stuff like that, they might say something about the dude has bad breath, or he's a little overweight, or he drinks too much, but nobody ever talks about like the snowstorm from his head or anything like that.
Yeah.
Right? Because like they powdered, and like pomade is actually very, very kind of waxy, stiff stuff, I'm pretty sure. It's something that you put in and then put powder in. And it helps it stiffens, but it also helps clean the hair a bit.
Well, but
It's got
we've been
herbs and all
oiling
that sort of stuff
ourselves
in it.
for centuries. Like the Greeks and Romans, they oiled themselves constantly.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they used olive oil, but like, and other things like that. But it's good for your skin. It's
Yeah.
good for your beard. One thing that someone asked in the chat before we start answering, because we have a question from Chihista, but Dazed Apricot asked about bad teeth, and that's a really easy one. So as far as bad teeth in the olden days, these are designed to last for your life. So if you're eating like meat and not rocks, but like if you're eating things that won't break your teeth, you are much less likely to develop plaque. Also, people have been using toothbrushes and toothbrush adjacent things like twigs to clean their teeth since before we were Homo sapiens. Since like a few evolutionary steps back, we have been flossing with twigs and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we did have that. Also, through archaeological record and whatnot, we've kind of figured out some of the different things we've seen. And specifically, like, peasantry could have, if you got old, you could have very worn down teeth, because when you grind flour, the poor people get the shitty stuff, which is full of little stones and grit. And so if you're chewing stuff with that in it for a very long period of time, say you're in your 70s and you're dying, your teeth will look very worn down. That is entirely possible. That's something that we see. But yeah, the rotten teeth, the black teeth, was a sign that you were rich, because you could afford sugar. And you were eating so much of it that no amount of tooth cleaning, which was kind of inferior to the sort of tooth cleaning we can do now, was going to fix that.
I mean, to be fair, the Romans had an ancient mouthwash that was very effective because it was very high in ammonia.
Yep,
they used pee.
around.
Yep, you swish some pee, you spit it out, then you chase it with some wine.
But the rotting
vinegar.
teeth stuff is not a misconception. It did happen. But generally it was the really rich people who were eating sugar at every single meal and snacking on sweets and all that sort of stuff constantly.
Our diets are, I don't want to say that our diets are worse, because that's some definite historic revisionism. But our teeth are designed to eat the things that we find outside and that we hunt. That isn't playing into like a paleo conspiracy, I hope.
Yeah, don't go too far on that, because we have evolved significantly from the time of eating nuts. And
I would say that we haven't quite evolved to like the point of eating sugar cubes being good for us.
No.
That is where I'm drawing my line.
You're saying like teeth were designed to do this. Yes, but ours have changed. Ours are not the same.
This is true. We do not have
originally.
the muscles of previous types of Homo.
Well, and our teeth are much smaller. Our jaws are much smaller. Our heads
Wisdom
are
teeth.
like, everything about our head is smaller except for the brain case. That stayed the same since about Homo erectus.
Our brains
Neanderthal.
are quite large.
But yeah, teeth have definitely changed and jaws have gotten smaller, which is why so many people have trouble with wisdom teeth nowadays, because they won't come in because you don't have space for them, because our jaw has gotten smaller.
So let's hop on another question here. So do you ever find yourself too committed to historical fact in historical games? I'm gonna pass this one around, but first I just want to say my rule for running these games is, if it doesn't fit the table, ignore it. You're not taking an exam. and that includes dialect. I always wince whenever I'm on stream and I go, oh, cool, or something like that. I use a modern slang term in the Victorian era, and I'm like, maybe it's Teddy, he's ahead of his time. But like,
You did that with me because I did that in like game 1, and you were like, yes, Concordia slang.
I know I did it too a couple times because I just forget, and it's like,
all you have to do is have Jen do it in front of you, and then you go, it's Concordia slang.
Right?
Ciao.
I'm an alien. It's fine.
You are an alien. It's great. But what else bugs you? What else? What about this like picks at you? Like what anxieties do you have about playing historical games, particularly on streams, because everybody can watch and critique in the chat? Well, actually, your hairstyle is definitely not. If you're doing this, we know. Shut up.
Oh yeah.
For me, it's like I prefer to do. I'm a research fiend, so I will do all of the research I can, and it's the in the moment things that I'm always a little more worried about, because I want to be historically accurate, but I also want to have fun doing it, right? So I don't want to hold on to that too much. But if I do all of the pre-research, like I think there's a scene where I fire my gun, and I'm like, the specific gun I have releases like a cloud of smoke when you fire it. So I made sure that Kelly knew that, so that he could accurately describe how the scene was going and stuff like that. But I definitely, I find myself falling into that trap a lot.
Thanks for falling.
I think the research, I think especially for like the Victorian game, I don't think I've researched as much for a character. Again, I'm new to RPGs and tabletop role-playing games, but D&D, you kind of just like, because it's a fantasy setting, you can kind of be like, okay, I'll look up some stuff and blend, and like at the end of the game it is a fantasy setting, so whatever. But for Victorian, I've done hours and hours and hours of research onto Darcy and her background. But some things it's like you kind of forget, and you kind of wince. And like, for example, the Cthulhu game that we did, that I totally forgot, and as the alcohol person I was like, duh. I forgot about Prohibition, and I was like, of course, Robin, the alcohol person, forgot about Prohibition. Fuck. And it's one of those moments where it's like, oh yeah, so I dislike being, wrong at
That was okay though, because you flubbed that in front of a character that was like totally down to help you acquire illegal alcohol.
Yeah.
So that was okay.
It is, but it's one of those moments where you're like, yes, of course, a known period of history that everyone knows about. Well, most people know about, especially in North America. And damn.
Okay, so Christine.
Well, like with the Victorian game, like I know a fair amount about Victorian England, and I definitely kind of pick and choose what I take, because you know what, Victorian hairstyles sucked.
Yeah, they really did.
My hairstyle
guys were okay.
In our Victorian mage game is more Edwardian than anything. It's not Victorian. Victorian is like slicked back, tight little buns with these tight little curls attached that are just ugly as sin.
Yeah.
Like a deformed
and they did this thing
Jared
with
Leto.
covering their ears half the time, and it's the sort of thing that you just can't do with a low quality wig. Like, I mean, you could, I suppose, if you had all the proper tools for styling wigs, like really, really good tools and like a good stand and all this stuff, and more knowledge than I have on wig styling. But I did what I could with what I had, and it's kind of it's reminiscent. Also, you have to remember that for all that we like to assign things periods and cut them all off and just like, it was only like this and during these years and that's it, it's not true.
No.
Like, it was flexible. Like,
anybody who thinks about that, go outside and tell me how many cars made before 2000 you see on the road.
Yeah.
How many square Buicks, square bumpers? Look for
just
square
go look
bumpers.
at fashion now. Like, I'm seeing stuff coming back that really reminds me of bell bottoms and whatnot.
Even the
and
joke that the 90s were the in Canada were like the 2000s. Like, there's that joke that, you know, there's the joke that
Canada's 10 years behind the States.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I moved to Canada, I got an extra 5 years out of my wardrobe. It was great.
Yeah.
Well, and like the 80s tended to be a bit more high-waisted pants, and then the 90s and 2000s went into super low-waisted, but now they're high-waisted again. Like,
Fashion is cyclical. It just is.
it shifts and changes, but honestly, most people in that era, unless you were extremely rich and thus could change your wardrobe every season, and by season I mean like the visiting season of being in London, the marriage mart,
Shop smart.
you
Shop
you
marriage
wouldn't
smart.
be updating it because it's expensive. Like, you might try and adjust your dress by taking it in or letting it out or taking bit. Like, that's the thing also, is trim was removable and changeable. That is one way to refresh an old dress, is by changing the trim on it, because you would take that off and reuse it somewhere else and put new stuff on.
Yeah, you like, if you were any type of moneyed person, you had people that could do that for you. So why not, right? Like,
Well, I mean, most women could, like,
Yeah, most
especially
women
say
could do it
Regency
themselves, yeah.
period. Most women could do needlework. That was like a required skill.
and I guess that was a lot of the time they spent in their day too, right? Because like,
There quite often tended to be useless needlework. Because if you were of a certain class, you couldn't be useful.
no.
That was
Everything
not
you did had to
ladylike.
be useless.
man,
The
that
more
sounds-
useless you were, the better you were.
Yeah, exactly. The higher class, fancier,
Yes.
more marriageable you were.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the big things that you need to keep in mind when you're running games, and this is something that I see a lot of people stumble on with history, is the idea of historical revisionism or historical idealism. The idea that things were better back then, or people, you always hear it from like parents or grandparents, like, well, when I was a kid, people didn't act like that. Yes, they did. Yes, they did. As a historian, let me put it this way. There's dick graffiti all over Pompeii. There's graffiti everywhere in the ancient world that's like, I slept with Lucius's mom.
What's that one that's like, it was so high up and people like went looking for it and they're like,
It was
we
in
need
a
to
she
know
was
what
in a
this
temple.
means.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I like so and so was here.
Yeah, there are two of them. There's one that's they found this one that was the one they found in a cave,
Yeah.
where they found this Norse rune like really high up, and when it was translated, it said like Hagvar was here.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
And there's another one in a church that was a really high up rune. And they finally went and translated it, and it said, "This is very high."
Yeah. Humans are gonna human. They're just
we're the same. We're the same.
People, well, we evolved into the state that we are like 200,000 years ago, something like that, and we've been the same ever since. Like, things change, like the way that we grow and raise each other is different, but people are always shit posting.
Yeah.
People are always trying to get drunk and have fun. People are like, we have not changed as people, we just have advances in how we do it.
Yeah, and the thing I always find hilarious linguistically is how we've come back around to hieroglyphics.
Oh god, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah,
Right?
oh, I've been thinking about that.
Yeah. So we had hieroglyphics, then we evolved other written language and other, other alphabets and all of this, and now we've come all the way back around to just emojis and
Well, it's just interesting to see how even the language evolved through like periods of time where letter writing, paper was expensive.
Yeah.
So there's examples of cross writing. So you would write, and you know what you do? You turn your paper sideways and write across it. Again, in between the letters of your previous writing. To be able to get to use the paper fully, but it's also where words changed. Because you know what? Writing "God be with ye" is really long. So they started abbreviating it. And guess what we ended up with? Goodbye.
Bye. Yep.
Goodbye. There are a lot of them. There's a fantastic little like mini documentary on YouTube about the evolution of the Thorn. Thorn being the equivalent to like it's kind of like the, wait, am I thinking the right thing? The Y? Yeah, it's because it's the TH,
Yeah.
right? So if you look at Ye Old Barbershop, it literally is just saying the old barbershop.
Yeah.
It's just that the Thorn letter kind of looked like a Y, and when typography evolved, I'm really glossing over this, they just kind of started putting a Y in because it was easier for typographers, because people didn't necessarily know what the Thorn was, Thorn being the combined letter. Kind of like the AE that you see sometimes with like Vitae or something like that. So
Also, when you're
just
reading like old text, F is generally S.
Yeah.
So if somewhere the word would look normal, except for that F in the middle, it's actually an S. Like the extra long down into the bottom
Bless you.
one F is actually S. So when you're trying to read older English.
Trying to read manuscripts is hard.
Oh God, yes.
So Paradox Talks has a great question here. Right before we hop into that, I just wanted to say that Nakra, you also brought up that like knight armor had penises on it. As a Roman historian, everything had penises on it all the time. And before we're done, I'd like to talk about dicks in history and
God, so many.
and gender in history and childhood in history, because teenagers and children, okay, so children have always kind of existed. Teenagers, young adults, that's new.
Yep.
Oh, thank you thanks, buddy. So first off, let's hop into this big question. We'll come back to that because I've got a fun story I told Robin at one point about how men were treated in the Roman world before a certain age.
Yeah.
I'll tell you real quick. This is a true fact. So we were having a conversation about how men's brains we peak out later than women. Women mature faster. Generally, this is very generalized. But men were slower. And such, this was actually recognized in ancient Rome, where it was generally like kind of an agreed upon thing that men were insane until they were 25. That men below the age of 25 were crazy. Like they were nuts. They were like wild men. And you couldn't trust them for anything. And they'd go out and rove the streets at night as gangs. And they'd go around to all of these charms that were everywhere, which were shaped like dicks because it was a phallic symbol of good luck. And they'd break all the dicks off. And it's a big thing, guys. It's really hilarious. But men were considered crazy. And they weren't wrong, really, because until we're 25, we really are jerks. And then about 25, we started tapering out as that testosterone starts to dip.
I mean, there's also the whole like brain development thing into your adulthood. I won't go into specifics on that because I can't remember how much of it is actually true, but definitely people are still developing.
Yeah. I mean, regardless of like gender.
Yeah. Yeah, anyone is.
That brain development doesn't end until quite a bit later than adulthood.
I think I've heard you like develop your patterns like because we talked about this a lot in like our metabolism classes. I think it's a lot like you will develop patterns and a lot of your likes and dislikes will be cemented between 20 and 25, as that's when like your taste in musics and your food thing. So I remember my university professor telling me like make sure like if you're wanting to try things like because like we're all like typically in that like 20 to 25 range, is like okay, make sure you go and try different things because this is your brain is starting to cement its ways and its chemicals, and your development is kind of slowing down and ending by this point. So it's a lot of like, oh yeah, you'll find the music that you listen to in your 20s is kind of then the music that you're going to listen to throughout the rest of your life, unless like you're constantly listening to new stuff. But a lot of your likes and dislikes get cemented in your 20s.
So if I ever
that's
have
not
kids...
to say though that you can't change.
Oh no, you can always change, but that's just typically your brain.
Because it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I decided I liked mushrooms after all.
Oh yeah, of course, and everything
actually
can change, but a lot of your that
because you didn't have anybody who could cook them well. Just saying. Anyway,
well,
Jen?
no, there's a really interesting thing about taste actually, because there's the whole like your cells change every 7 years. It's why people can grow out of allergies, but you can also grow into liking how things taste, which is really weird to me. So like I hated eggs as a child. I hated pepper, and when I like at some time in my 20s, I suddenly decided I loved eggs and with pepper, and now I can't eat them anymore. So I'm sad, but you can do that, which is wild. I do want to point out one thing that chat mentioned before we get too much further, in that just because we all recognize that boys and men mature slower, it doesn't make it okay what they do.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's just funny that we've always been assholes, I guess, and it's not funny, but it's a little funny that they were like, just don't. They're these like 22. Just don't. Yeah.
Hilarious. We just can't.
We've always had frat
on
boys.
The boys will be boys nonsense.
Oh yeah, no, that's not what I'm saying. Boy, I like the memes.
Guys
where it's like
are more
boys...
likely to be impulsive at that age.
Yes.
What they do with that impulsiveness
If the
can be guided by
impulsivity-
society.
Mhm.
If the impulsivity is like, oh, let's find an abandoned like hill and do like wheelbarrow races down and die, that's fine.
Well, and
Because
I
you're doing
read
that to
a really
yourself.
good
It's-
one recently where somebody was pointing out like the boys will be boys thing should apply more in the way like they live next to a frat house, and one morning they saw like one of the guys come out and check and see if a pair of pants they left out overnight had frozen,
Yeah.
and then went running back inside to let the others know, and they all came out screaming yo, freaking out over the fact that the pants were frozen solid in position.
Yeah,
Like
that's absolutely.
that's boys will be boys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boys will be boys stuff should be fun. It should
Yeah.
not. It shouldn't hurt anybody. Like out, and nobody who didn't agree to potentially be hurt in that. Like I don't know. Anyway, we have a great question. That's a
I
good
think
point
that
though.
segues perfectly into the.
So
kind
speaking of
next
boys
quest.
being boys,
Let's talk about misogyny.
so yeah, I'm gonna take a back seat to this one. So as historic aware players, is it hard to play past gender roles and sexism that some DMs want to put into their games?
I won't play under those DMs.
Unless, well, you say that, but in
I
our
won't play under anyone who will force it.
No, see, the way the question is worded makes it sound like the DMs who are pushing it in, and that thus I have to submit to those gender roles and act like the woman from that time period.
No.
No, what we're doing in Victorian Mage is you're putting it all in with our
Told you
consent
to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so that we can rail against it.
Yeah.
You're
It's
not
true.
pushing us to stay within our roles of, oh, you can't do that. You're a woman in this time period. Oh, all the NPCs are going to talk down to you and ignore you, and you're going to have no power in this game. That's bullshit. That's not a fun game. Your DM sucks. Leave them.
that is absolutely, yeah.
Or at least have a very serious talk with them about how shitty they're being.
We ran a panel on consent that was partially, it was like love, sex, and consent. It was last night. Go check it out. Because consent and communication with your party or with your table is the most important thing you can do in a game. But please keep going. So
So I think as historic aware, I think it just kind of depends on if like we all really wanted that misogyny like brought up to the point where Kelly was like, I feel bad that I'm treating you
Yeah.
guys like this, and we're like, no. If you're comfortable,
put the
give
power
us
in our hands.
more.
Yeah.
Well,
Put
and
the
I
power in
think-
our hands and let us, as Christine said, rail against it and actually take that control back.
When we
Mhm.
have the support of having the enlightened male NPCs, right?
okay, the NPCs that you're calling me enlightened. I'm like, don't do it.
Right. So
But-
we have
Teddy.
male NPCs that reflect that side of society where they knew full well that women were smart, and whatnot.
And don't
That doesn't
let
mean
your
that
DM
was-
say that those people didn't exist.
Yeah, like there's a reason why in if you go look at suffrage writings and pamphlets from the time period, and the pamphlets against them depict henpecked husbands and stuff like that, because they had to try and make fun of the guys who were supporting it somehow and make them
Yeah.
seem less masculine and less okay, to try and make it clear that, oh, well, they're supporting it because they're not masculine and they're not in control, sort of thing. So that does show that there were men who thought, yeah, you guys, this is full of shit.
Also, anybody
My wife
who
can
tried-
vote. She's smart. She runs our whole household. I don't know how to do that.
Anyone who tries to claim historical accuracy on you should probably Google some cultures outside of what's popular in popular culture in the West. The Viking culture, for example, is becoming more popular. Was much more egalitarian than, or much more equal than anything we've seen in normal fantasy pop culture. Women killed people. Women had divorce powers. Women had a lot more rights.
You look at
than you'd
Sparta too,
expect.
right?
Oh yeah, Sparta.
Sparta.
Also,
Sparta.
anybody who thinks that Victorian, Edwardian, Regency women didn't have a lot of control over what happened is full of shit.
It's
They just weren't supposed to advertise it.
Yeah,
it's
no,
the
they did it
whole-
from their living rooms.
Yeah, it's the whole victories written by the winners, right? So the men are like, we're the winners, and therefore we're the ones who are writing all this shit and don't believe
Well,
it.
And like, yeah, go ahead, Robin.
okay, I was gonna say like, and like bringing back a little bit of my thing, like for history, a lot of history, like female brewers and winemakers were way more popular and like it's only recently that the wine world and beer world have become like a men dominated thing. There is tons of accounts in history that it's female brewers a lot that was brought up and started this. It's just yeah, it started becoming a male thing and they kind of took over. But like even in the wine world and brewing world, like women were very much the lead and head brewers for a lot of.
When did that start segmenting off? Like, because I know like all the stories about monks and things like that taking the beer production and like making that a big part of what they did with their days. But like, when did like why is it just in the past like 100 years or so that wine has been kind of masculinized for winemaking?
I forget the exact
Ballpark it.
I think it's probably when the times in where they kind of the women were meant to be more of the homemakers, where they weren't supposed to necessarily work or actually do anything, and they're just trying to raise families, so they kind of it kind of fell onto the men to take up that thing once women were supposed to go back into the household and into the kitchen.
So okay, that's really interesting. We have a follow-up about the last question, which is so with gender roles and sexism, even with consent, isn't it hard to see the role mental health wise so isn't it hard to experience that sexism? I can't really weigh in on this. The best that I could think is like, I don't know.
You act like we don't already.
Yeah.
Oof.
Daily life.
Yeah.
It's a thing.
At least this gives us a place where
we can punch the assholes.
We can punch the assholes. We don't have to really worry about going to jail because our characters might go to jail, some sort of prison or whatever.
The number of times I've been mansplained to and told how my job works by somebody who doesn't do my job, or how aspects of my job work, and I'm listening to them get it completely wrong and can't say anything because they won't listen, or they just talk over you. Or I used to work in automotive parts and whatnot. I used to be an apprentice mechanic at one point. The number of times working at a parts desk where I'd like to speak to a man was done by men and women.
Yeah.
Is insane. And I got used to just laughing it off because good luck. There's no other man in the department. Get bent. You want your part or not?
Well, for me, it's like the men let you into the cellar, eh? Like they let you handle the fermentation, like ooh, or like get your pink tool set, and it's like,
oh yes, let me just whip my dick out and stir the fermentation or something. Like, why is this important?
I always rant about this. I just want to say this because you brought up pink. Pink is not a girly color. It wasn't a girly color until it was decided on a girly color. Yeah. So
it was the opposite. Blue for girls and pink.
Because red was manly, so pink was for little boys.
You know why clothes are pink? Because you bleed on them and then wash them. That's literally the
and
pink
blue's a
thing.
soft color.
Yeah,
so,
it's like
blue is
also
soft
blue
and delicate and feminine.
Here's a fun one. The color blue didn't exist in the ancient world. That's one that's pretty mind-blowing. So like the color blue existed, like with the spectrum wave existed, but we didn't really, like, at least in ancient Greek, there's not a word for blue. There are words for, if you look at the old hymns, they say or like hymns, the old like Homeric writings, they refer to things as like wine dark, and like they don't use words like blue for blue. They use red. They use all the other, but blue does not exist. Yeah. Blue is a more recent concept, which is weird. We're weird beings. Robin.
Oh, I was just like agreeing, like, yeah, that's weird, that's cool. But yeah, no, like, to go off Christine, it's like, yeah, we see sexism in our daily lives. The fact we get to have a environment where it's
incredibly blatant.
we get to fight against it. We get to have that little bit of moment where all the things I want to say to that customer that I can't necessarily say because it's a paying customer or whatever, like those things you boil and hold in, you finally get to like say them and know that you're just saying it to a character and not necessarily like getting actual repercussions of doing it. It's a nice nice way to, I think, deal with that kind of annoyance in daily life.
I think.
Well, and
yeah.
before anybody brings anything up of like, oh, well, in your jobs, just go to the HR department. No. HR is there to protect the company, not there to protect the worker.
Don't confuse it, please.
Yeah.
They're not.
Some
for
HR
you.
departments might be good and might actually support you in that sort of thing, like they're technically supposed to. But for the most part,
Think about the terminology there. It's human resources. That means that you are a resource. You are not a person in their eyes. So just saying, like, if it was like a resource like a water department, they would still talk to the people that manage the water. They would talk to the water. Just gonna. Sorry, it popped into my head. So, and to anybody who says that the idea of having sexism in games for players to rail against and triumph against is merely straw manning sexists. So what?
Yeah, you know what? It's fucking relieving and fun to hit a sexist in the face.
I mean, isn't like
Might not
a
be
goblin
solving
just
anything, but makes me feel better.
A goblin is just a propped up monster that you can beat on. Why not a sexist?
And I see wedding dresses have come up in chat. Wedding dresses were not a singular color. Up until about Queen Victoria's, where she popularized a white wedding dress. And even then, it took a long time for it to really catch on to being, that is what you did. Wedding dresses were just a nice dress.
And let's not get into like diamond rings and things like that. Like the De Beers
bullshit.
Company. Look up the De Beers Corporation and...
Their marketing scam.
Oh god, it's such a good marketing scam. And now, because Russia owns a third of the world's diamonds, De Beers is getting... You notice that a lot of diamond engagement rings and wedding rings that have diamonds in them are starting to move towards more clusters because the large diamonds are apparently more owned by Russian companies now, but they have this trade between them to create market scarcity. There's also this huge push right now for all types of stone because you can do created diamonds. Like we can create diamonds like super easy. We do it all the time for industrial means, and they've started doing it for like general means. Here's a fun one for you dungeon masters. If you're gonna have something fun at the table and you've got an extra $100 in your pocket, buy a handful of rubies. Not even kidding. Real rubies that you can order online from companies. They are actual rubies. They're just synthetic. But these companies are saying that, oh, well, doesn't she deserve better than a piece of carbon? It's the exact same frickin' piece of carbon, and I can get it exactly the way I like it, and I didn't have to have someone die for it. Some guy in Shanghai made this in a lab. That's fine. He went home to his family.
It's still
Organic chemistry just teaches
same structure.
You know what? It still sparkles the same.
Mm-hmm.
Or better, because you can customize it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right,
honestly,
but yeah.
everything is carbon.
But
Not
Everything is
but
carbon.
How many things is carbon?
But yeah, like with weddings and whatnot and wedding dresses, white was really uncommon. Queen Victoria popularized it, and the way she was presented and the way she presented herself is very virginal and very pure and whatnot, all got connected to white, which white did have some of those connotations. However, white also had serious funeral connotations because quite often a body was wrapped in a white linen shroud.
And
nobody wants to look like they're a corpse on their wedding day.
So two things about that. The first is, don't ever forget that different cultures have different color schemes. Black and white for us are inverted in certain Asian cultures. So like white is a more like traditional color to wear during like weddings and special events, whereas black is seen as a funerary color, I believe, in certain parts of China, if I'm not mistaken. So when you're doing a fantasy world, mix it up. Also, weddings don't look like Christian weddings in history. Like that's a newer phenomenon. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, like Jen, you can cover this probably better, but like weddings in like the medieval age were a lot more casual a lot of the time because it was basically more like common law a lot of the time. Like, oh, you are my wife. Like maybe the village elder.
Yeah, because prior to like, I'm gonna say, this sounds weird because the church was big through a lot of time, but prior to like the church. Yeah.
Like more the Church of England.
Yeah.
So prior to the Protestant split for the most part.
Yeah, stuff like that. Yeah. Weddings could be really super casual.
Yeah.
And then they started linking, marriage to taxes and stuff, and then church and state got entwined, and now it sucks, but
the absolute best weddings were Spartan weddings though. You guys want a 30-second Spartan wedding?
Sure.
Okay, so as a Spartan, you had to be at least 30 years old before you could marry your bride, which was usually around 12, 13 years old, right? You made an arrangement with the father, and depending on whether or not you actually knew each other beforehand, it's all up in the air. That was the general purpose. Until you were 30, generally a Spartan boy was put into military service, or at least the steps to military service around age 6 or 7. They lived on the streets as a bit of a thief for a while, where they were constantly beaten if they were ever caught, to teach them self-sufficiency and survival. Then they went into the army. At age 30, they were allowed to marry. Until then, they lived with the bros at the hall. And all of their relationships, platonic and romantic, were with other men. So, to help social lubrication during the wedding night, they would take the girl who was being married and they would cut her hair like a boy's to ease the transition. And it was tradition that a Spartan soldier on his wedding night would break into her house and abduct her. Like you had to kidnap her. Now she knew you were coming. I think they were supposed to put up a little bit of a token defense. It's been a couple years since I've studied this, but you were supposed to abduct her in the night and take her back to your house.
I mean, I would expect that they would expect to put up a token defense, considering how like Spartan women are presented.
Spartan women
They're also
were
trained
cool.
in fighting.
Yeah.
So
And like if you actually look at any old texts that talk about it, like Athenian women are often like very frail and studious and motherly. Spartan women are like in all
they're
of the
tanks. They're
they're
great.
tanks because they're the only women in the ancient world that were encouraged to exercise.
Yep.
They worked out like constantly. So and in the old days, you worked out naked. So these are tank women in great shape with a full body tan.
Yeah.
Like these like covered in olive oil so they didn't burn too, right? Like these were like Spartan women were hot. I'm sorry. Like and like the other thing about
is like, ooh, that must, I guess like if they get built they probably have smaller chests. I'm just thinking about all the
well, I mean
bouncing
like,
and swaying it must be doing.
I mean they were tough, right? Like
Yeah.
So the only way to get a funeral if you the only way to get a headstone if you were a Spartan man was to die in battle. Or to be a king. I think they got monuments and things like that. It's been like 15 years since my degree, so pardon me. The way to get a headstone as a woman was to die in childbirth, which was considered of equal honor to a battle.
Which I always
So-
respected about the Spartans.
Right? It's like, well, it's a battle. Now, mind you, the Spartans were fascists and slave owners.
There
and
were a
like,
whole
but
bunch of things wrong with the Spartans, but that part they got right.
that part they got right. And we're historically far enough from them that you can call it some of their cool stuff. Like, yeah, would I want them around today to boss me around? Nope. I like Gerard Butler just fine, but nah, I'm okay. So they were pretty great.
So do we want to quickly talk about kind of going off and like using like certain periods of time and you know, choosing to either how do you want to deal with nuances as, you know, different topics that have been bad in history, and using them at, you know, if you're doing something from like different periods of times where people have had slaves.
Maybe.
And do we
Okay.
want to discuss that a little bit and kind of using that in your games? Because like not using it in your games, but like,
So
do you omit that or do you nod to it? And
you know what?
just
Let's
not?
just be blunt. So, folks, we're going to
Yeah.
talk about some things that may be particularly uncomfortable or triggering for you. The themes that are going to come up are probably, I don't know what they are because this is going to be a casual conversation, but might include themes of sexual violence, might include themes of slavery or racism or horrific acts. So please, if this is not the conversation for you, come back later. We have a fantastic costuming panel at 2. But in the meanwhile, I think one of the big ones is if you have a period game or you have a game set in the ancient world, should you have slaves? Should you have slavery? Because if you look at D&D 5e, half of the evil races are slavers. A good, like, at least half of them. The Koatoa, the Gith, the Drow are huge slavers. Out of the Abyss, the module starts with you being enslaved by the Drow. Okay? Does anybody have a thing about that? Because what I say is that it's a conversation.
It's
definitely a
definitely a conversation, and I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up that I didn't really think about. It's true. It's like, yeah, in D&D we have these fantasy races that are have that are slavers, and then we have actual history, and it's just kind of like, yeah, it's definitely a conversation to have at your panel, like, or at your table.
At least with D&D, they do like directly connotate slavery with evil. However, like if you want to play, like, say, a World of Darkness game or something set in a period in which slavery was common, I think that is a conversation with your players to kind of decide what level of this are you actually comfortable with. Because I would say it's one thing to have maybe some of the characters that you don't agree with, like the NPCs that you don't agree with, or that you're maybe set opposite to. Could be like plantation owners or slave owners. I would say don't get gratuitous, because that's real life stuff that you're talking about where people actually suffered and like dealt with that. But I think it is very much a conversation with your characters, because while you might not want to go too far into it, or if you do want to contain it, I think one of the worst things you can do is do the fake the happy slave thing, which is just propaganda and bullshit.
Yeah. No, I mean, that,
not to say that some people,
you can go through history and find the exception that makes the rule to everything.
Like, that's not to say that, yeah, doing the whole like, oh, well, yeah, a lot of people snitched on each other in these sort of situations in order to survive. That doesn't mean that they were happy as slaves or anything like that.
They just were, they
were trying to make their best decision in the situation they were in order to save their own life and keep their comfort level up. Like, so was it a great decision? Probably not. But would they have gotten killed for it? For like making a different decision? Maybe.
There are a couple people in the chat right now that are talking about. Daisy Apricot asked, "Are there any D&D races that are automatically evil?" And I think that my gut instinct, because Wizards is trying to phase that out and say that like all creatures can be anything they want, that you don't have to be an evil drow. But at the same point, if you get into that, do all dogs have spots question, where it's like, okay, if the drow are slavers, but they can also be good, does that mean you can have good slavers? No, you can't. Period. You're going to have cognitive dissonance with this, and you honestly should evaluate what you're doing when you run your games. And I think that at the beginning of Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, this may be completely wrong, I remember there being a box at the beginning of one of their books that talks about Nazism or fascism, and basically says that anybody who wants to use the game for those purposes can fuck off. I forget the exact phrasing, but I know Plastic Age Plays is in the chat, and I'm pretty sure that you know what I'm talking about. So if you can confirm that'd be great. And the other thing is that we had a question in the chat that was, how many societies were far more open and accepting of same-sex partners, bisexuality, homosexuality, and so on in history? And what I want to do is, I want to, as the cis white dude of the chat, like, alternate sexualities have always existed. Trans people have always existed. Period. They're not new. They're not.
Again,
period. Now everyone else
written by the victors. History written by, the people who are in power tends to wipe out a lot of that stuff that was there. It's the whole, this painting of these two women in bed together, they were just friends or just roommates.
Yeah, the two spinsters who lived together.
Yeah, just friends.
Yeah, it could be just friends, but you know what?
They're just the best of friends.
Quite often, the way it was worded, they were very much life partners, and you know what? For the most part, nobody gave a shit because it was two chicks. Who cares?
Yeah.
They're also two spinsters. Nobody wants to marry them. Oh, well. People are much more seemingly threatened when it's men, and much more intent on prosecuting it, at least in Western societies, when it's men. See Oscar Wilde and Alan Turing.
Yeah, well, like in ancient history, it was encouraged, I'm going to say, to have relations amongst men, because if you loved your fellow men, you would die for them in battle, and it made better soldiers. but they would
Also, you
still
didn't make
be
babies.
they would still be expected to marry women and have children. So,
Yeah, well, because you reproduce, you need to for the
Yeah.
armies, right?
Yeah.
And that's totally, I mean, like, honestly, sexuality as a prescribed construct is a newer philosophy. I just wanted to make sure I had the exact date, and it's a little earlier than I thought. Let's do a quick poll. What is the first known use of the word homosexual in history? It's earlier than I thought, but not as earlier. So the first common use, does anybody have a guess?
No idea.
Okay.
Pretty recent, I think.
So it's less recent than you think. It's the first known public appearance in print was in 1869 in a German pamphlet. Of course, it was a German pamphlet with all the trouble that Germany's had with it.
I was thinking somewhere.
Actually, that is about what I was thinking.
I
Yeah,
was thinking that was
1800s.
so common usage didn't really kind of work its way in until the early 1900s when it was popularized by the Hadrian-Eulenberg affair.
Also, marriage didn't equal love.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Like, marriage was a contract. It was a monetary, and that it had value. It was not.
Women
to do with
had
love.
dowries, men would
Yep.
give them good lives, and women would supply them with heirs to carry on their family name
Yeah.
Mhm.
and to
There are
do
a lot
work
of
on like whatever farm or whatever they had if they needed that.
there are a lot of movies that kind of villainize the practice, particularly when they're trying to show that like whatever lord or noble is a real douche. Where the lord will show up in the woman's room, make a couple of comments about how he doesn't like her, and then be like, "All right, take your britches off. Let's make an heir." And that's like treated like a really bad thing. It was a business transaction, and we need to really separate that. Being the fact that he was a jerk to her is the bad part.
Mhm.
The fact that
Mhm.
she's like, "I live like this and am willing to do this exchange," is not bad. It's just it's life. It is a form of sex work.
A great, like, into the Lord's house. Probably was waited on by, ladies and other servants, and she probably had a fairly decent life. But yeah,
Probably
it's
boring.
probably boring, but probably was good. Like, it wasn't.
Well, it depends on the time period as well. And I saw that it was a contract between a husband and wife's father. Frequently, yes. However, at least by Edwardian or Regency times, women did have an age of majority. And they could agree to a marriage contract without their father's permission once they passed that age. So they could kind of get forced married before that. However, for the most part, that was fairly socially unacceptable.
Mhm.
Like, generally, you probably would have to pressure your daughter into like conforming to family best interests, which, I mean, if you're raised that way,
Yeah.
you might be doing this to help your family. Like,
Right.
look at Pride and Prejudice. That's essentially what they wanted like Elizabeth to do with like Collins. Protect your family.
So on this, we'll be talking more about this in the gender panel that is tomorrow. But also, just remember, when you're running a fantasy game or any type of role-playing game set in history, things were a lot more flexible than they are now. We have boxed things up a lot more. Things were much more fluid. Other things to know is that I see a lot of people complaining online about like race mixing in historical pictures or historical shows, and it's like, well, why is that person there? They're black. Yeah, there were plenty of black people in Victorian England.
Yeah, Britain outlawed slavery first.
Yeah. By the way, so Americans, we aren't really taught this, but we were like 60 years behind. I forget, is it 160 or pardon me, not 16, 1803 was the British Slave Act.
Oh, I've forgotten the exact date of it.
Yeah.
I never paid attention to dates because you didn't really need to know that stuff. Besides, these things happen at the same time. Because you know what? You can look it up real easy.
1833. It was 1833. So it was 33 years before the Americans did it. There are stories. If you're bringing this to the table, be careful. Make sure everybody's on par with it, on board with it. But during World War, I think it was as late as World War II, American troops would go to England, and the Brits would, treat them quite well. It's American troops coming to help the war effort, so they're going to be like, pretty cordial to them until they do something wrong, but they would treat the African American soldiers the exact same as the white soldiers, and the white soldiers would get really pissed about it and would start bar fights and would cause a big scene because we still had segregation as law at that point. We still had Jim Crow, and the Brits just didn't understand it because it just wasn't as much of a deal there. I mean, I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist in Britain throughout history, but comparative
India.
Racism, Brexit.
Also true.
But like, there's things like this, or like Rome. Like, everyone's like, oh, Rome, they were all Italians. Yeah, they were all a bunch of Italians being like, oh, you know, bippity boppity Roman phalanx, right? No, they weren't. I mean, they were, but like, they weren't a bunch of Italian guys. Like, a bunch of the emperors were from Africa.
Sylvester Slays.
Thanks, Sylvester Slays. That was a meme explosion. Like, there were,
travel was hard, but it's not that it didn't exist.
well, and it was easier during Rome. The roads were good.
Absolutely.
Well, that's one of the things is like Victorian London was actually fairly multicultural because that was the height of the empire. So that's not to say they weren't racist and that white guys were way more important than anybody else, but the mix of the city was incredibly diverse.
Race meant different things back then too than it does today. It meant a lot of things. Like, you could be particularly racist against a type of an ethnicity. So like today it would be like, say you are racist against Asians. Well, you could be racist very specifically against a population like Mongolians back then, and fine with like a Mandarin speaking neighbor, right? So it was very complex.
What white is white today was not white then.
Yeah.
Polish was
Irish.
not really necessarily considered white. Ukrainian, like all those sort of areas,
Italian.
like were not considered white people because that was white British or like
also
Irish, Scottish. They hated each other a lot. They still do in some ways.
I really want to say this so that it's stated in the panel, because we've only got about 13 minutes left before I have to do wrap. But another part about history, and this is not my field of expertise, but it is something that a lot of us know, and some people in the chat I know have studied this very well. When we are taught about the indigenous communities of North America, we are often taught that, oh, they were a bunch of separate tribes that hated each other and killed each other, and it was okay. That's a very complex issue that we don't have time to dive in. But what I want to say right off the bat is something that Christine brought up about trade networks. The trade networks in North America before colonization were incredible. There are traces of constant trade between what is modern, Montreal, Ontario in Canada, and Mexico, or more southern.
Oh yeah, there's all sorts of like shell beads and whatnot up here that come from South America. Because you've got to consider if you're looking at history and you're looking at it in a sense of, oh, uncivilized, you have to consider what civilized, what is your definition of civilized, who gave you that definition, and how you were indoctrinated to it. Because you know what? North and South America had the same sort of trade routes, cultures, difference, all that sort of stuff, and languages that Europe, Africa did. They just had a different type. They had a different way of doing it that when we came in as people who were considered themselves like large and in charge and had a set of concepts of what ownership meant that didn't work here, didn't bother to learn how it worked here, and were just like, well, they don't do it our way. Plant a flag, it's ours now.
Yeah, we were very good at that. I gotta ask Robin, looking back, what did people drink back then in North America pre-colonization? Do you know? Did that come up at all? Because like a lot of things like whiskey and like a lot of hard alcohols were introduced by Europeans coming over. But they had to like.
I don't think they. Oh,
I don't know. It's been very clearly studied.
It hasn't. I think that is, yeah, it's definitely not been studied because I know, I mean, there are some, like, there's quite a few grape varietals that are from North America, typically more on the eastern coast. Vitis labrusca and Vitis, I'm forgetting the name, but mainly
Also, corn came
Vitis
from
labrusca.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, by the way, the word corn doesn't mean what you think it does. If you go and ever look up some ancient Roman stuff, and it'll be like, oh yeah, there's corn everywhere. Corn means like grain.
Yeah.
It got attached to maize and stuck. So like they didn't have like ears of corn in ancient Rome. Just letting you know.
But yeah, I don't think there's much that was the wine and beer is more of a
Also, cacao.
colonization.
Oh,
Yeah.
cacao is such an interesting story. If you
Cacao was a very popular drink, especially South America.
I also think just in general, because
Also, tequila comes from this continent,
That's
yeah,
true.
it does.
general area, right?
But because of
down in Mexico.
yeah, the natural or not natural,
What's
but
the
the respect that a lot of indigenous cultures had for nature and whatnot, it's possible that their water consumption was higher because, and this is just pure conjecture on my part, but because Europe and whatnot had the industrial revolution of just like, let's pollute things, and while there would still be issues with pure water.
That's not to say that go out and
yeah.
drink from a stream.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yeah,
You do not
definitely
want
don't.
the beaver fever.
No.
I think what I remember learning, and this is going back to my high school history that we talked about when we learned about the West Coast indigenous cultures. It was more about for them it was more the smoking of different herbs and tobacco was more of the thing versus alcohol. So I don't know what they necessarily did for that, but I don't think wine was as big of a thing.
So how did
So and this is Wikipedia, so I take this with a huge grain of salt.
Wikipedia is so much better than it was when we were in our school the first time, though.
Absolutely.
It's so good now.
Yeah. It's pretty good.
I like to use it as a jumping off point for research. But the agave plant, they would make alcohol from the agave plant.
Yeah, there's so many cool things. North American, well, I say North American history, but I mean like New World history in general is so interesting when you look at it, because there's a lot of questions of there's a fantastic video by CCP Gray over on YouTube that talks about why plagues became so virulent, or why there are no New World plagues. And it's a really great video if you are looking to ever have that type of mobile societies or non-industrial societies built in your games, because it talks about how there weren't very many plagues in the New World because sanitation conditions were much better. You didn't have medieval cities that turned into Victorian cities built up on top of piles of shit. You had
you have to remember that with not having a lot of agriculture in this area, that's not to say it didn't exist, because some areas you can't just say First Nations did this. It doesn't work that way.
Sure.
Because for instance, more here on the coast, there tended to be more settlements, but also that those could shift a bit. So that you kind of have summer and winter. You'd have areas you would go where the resources were. So you would want to be on the river or on the ocean when the salmon were spawning and stuff like that, right? When you were getting the resource coming there, that's where you wanted to be. But you wouldn't stay there if you had no resources.
It's really interesting to look this kind of stuff up, because when you do, you kind of dissect a lot of fantasy tropes, and I am not comparing real world races with fantasy races in this. I just want to say that. But if you look at tribal or nomadic lifestyles, say orcs are usually depicted as tribal, wood elves often depicted as tribal, and then you actually look at real world examples of humans who have lived like that. Spend some time looking up any of the indigenous bands in Ontario particularly were very interesting for me to learn, because you learn about their lifestyles, which were very good. like they were very casual.
Oh, the
And, like-
Maori in New Zealand, I was
Mm.
so fascinated learning about their history of like New Zealand, and it's just it's fascinating how they like, well, from my limited time there, hearing stories and hearing some things about it, it's just like, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and just like the general lifestyle was like communal raising of kids, and like, oh yeah, like you wake up like slightly before dawn and you work until noon. And then you spend the rest of the day playing with your family and like relaxing and fishing, and like, because you have built up a plentifulness in your environment
Mhm.
that it only requires 4 hours of work a day if everybody pitches in. That's cool. Like,
Yeah.
have some of your fantasy races do stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Like, because like decolonizing orcs is impossible for your homebrew settings. I'm gonna put that out there. There's too much baggage.
Just because I kept reading this Wikipedia article, I should stop hyperfixating on this. But anyways, speaking of ADHD,
Please,
It's
Um,
like, good thing we put that tag on.
haha, right?
Point
Vancouver Island would do elderberries, mollusks, and tobacco to make an alcoholic drink.
Huh.
And then like Kodiak Island, they would make alcoholic drinks from fermented raspberries.
Oh, that
Yeah,
sounds
everywhere had an
great.
alcoholic drink of some sort, just because
Yeah.
it's safer
And then
to
also
drink.
cacti for some groups. Yeah.
It's like, for the most part,
If you
Water
can
where you're
ferment
not-
it, you'll make an alcoholic drink. out of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We were pretty.
well, because
motivated
when
for
you
that.
start looking at, like, say, tribal is a really bad word.
Tribal is a really bad word.
I really don't like the word tribal because it lumps so many different types of groups together. So nomadic, pastoralist, all these sort of like,
Tribal is nice.
there's a lot of these different terms if you look at them in an anthropological sense to kind of define types of lifestyle. And there's different versions within them. But generally those are lifestyles that can only support a certain size of group to begin with. Like, the reason we can have big cities and whatnot is because of our like agriculture. It ended up supporting class divisions, which meant that you didn't work less, except for the people who could get in control, and also you got shittier diet from it. There's actually areas where they've done archaeological reports and like investigation, and they're showing that, yeah, agriculture as a diet was really not good because you had all sorts of anemia lesions on your bones and stuff. And you know how long you have to be really anemic to get lesions on your bones? It's pretty bad. Whereas the group next door, who were not living agriculturally but were living a kind of pastoralist nomadic lifestyle of hunter-gatherer type, didn't have those problems because
So
they
I
were
have a
getting enough different
question.
stuff.
Yeah, please.
I'm just thinking for like for terms. I'm thinking back again, kind of thinking back to Vancouver Island. So we have like orcas, and we have the stay-at-home pods. We also have transient pods that are the ones that like swim around and do hunter-gatherer style. I'm wondering, like, is transient a bad word to use like regarding that kind of lifestyle, or
It's not the accurate word.
it's not the actual word?
Um,
Okay.
Typically there
Also,
was
there is some,
versions
like-
of like pastoralism where, so there's a couple of different terminologies, but hunter-gatherer is one thing. Generally you tend to stay in a certain area. Nomadic is that you travel all over.
Oh,
Pastoralists tend to have that kind of where they follow their herd in a circle, essentially, where they have a set range
yeah,
that they go
they
to.
have a route.
So that's a
basically. Okay.
pastoralist society
Okay.
for the most part,
Hmm.
where you might be growing small gardens, but you're doing it in a very seasonal way wherever you are. You're following your herd to a pasture where that's good in spring, that one's good in summer, we go over there for
Okay.
winter, because that's where those different areas were set up for different types of food growing in those different times. You didn't just stay in one spot. But some groups had a very tight area where they stayed in. Others ranged quite far. And then
Now
you
we're-
also have ones that did generally stay kind of roughly in an area, and traveled out for pasture and then back and forth. So specifically groups like, say, the Sami in northern Europe,
Oh.
Sweden, Russia area. where they live very much off of their herd, not by killing them, but by taking them to pasture and whatnot, and then you take all of their byproducts, including blood.
And then you get other ones like the Mongols, if I'm not mistaken, who actually did live off of their horse herds by bleeding them at night to drink.
That's what Sami did. They just have reindeer.
Did they do that as well? Okay,
yeah.
Interesting.
Well, most pastoralist societies that have a herd, you do not kill any of them for meat. You do not eat meat for the most part unless you hunt it. You bleed them. And you get a bit of blood, and you mix it with stuff, and you have milk. So you have fermented milk drinks, and then you have cheeses and
there were
butters
fermented blood drinks, if I'm not mistaken, as well. That you could ferment the blood from. I think the
blood generally got mixed because by the time you could leave blood long enough to ferment, it would be all coagulated and gross.
I didn't say it was good.
I'm pretty sure they mixed it with stuff that fermented.
Caitlin, this is an idea for your tiefling blood cleric.
Nice.
But yeah, because you didn't need much. You got the iron from it and that sort of stuff.
So with that, I just want to say that obviously none of us are Indigenous scholars. So anything like we're just kind of a broad like pastoralism around the globe type of discussion at this point. But like, and if we wanted to go much deeper into like North American like Indigenous history and culture and role playing games, we probably would want to bring somebody in who's actually like an expert in the field. I'd love to get the people who just did that book Coyote and Crow. Have you all seen that? It's like a 5e setting that is set in kind of like untouched, like indigenous fantasy. Looks really cool. The art direction is incredible. But so I think that we should probably start wrapping up right now because we have about 5 minutes for the rest of this panel, and then for our outros, and then we got to get ready for the costuming panel at 2. So. Does anybody want to say their... I want to thank everybody for taking time to come and talk history. Because this really didn't feel like an hour and 45 minutes. Like it felt like 20 minutes of just shooting the breeze with you guys, really as always. True. But have you considered this?
Well, and also, I'm just saying, because Paradox Talks was asking about it, pastoralism has multiple meanings. So we're talking about pastoralism in an anthropological sense regarding like a cultural definition.
Not like an English literature
culture.
sense.
Yeah. Whereas like pastoralism in the romantic sense or in literature sense is very different.
Yeah.
Oh, Crimson Galaxy just told me that it's actually a D12 system with a whole homebrew setting. That's so interesting.
If I get a chance, I will pull out a couple of my base anthropology textbooks if I still have them, and I can potentially find some links because I still have access to some stuff that I might be able to find open access for.
Nice.
So
if you need help finding open access for things, let me know.
Well, I'll start with my university's library and go from there.
Yeah.
All right. So let's do a quick round of saying who we are, where you can find us, and let's call it a day. Robin, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Or I guess thanks for showing up, everyone. It was fun talking history with y'all. You can find me at Second Gen Gamer, but mainly here on Twitch. It's been a fun time, and I think best thing is like there's a lot of resources out there. Google, you start with Wikipedia and then find like journals through that as well to search if you're interested. That the information is abundant thanks to the internet.
I can't wait until we can get Dork Tales sponsored by Curiosity Stream so we can drop that at the end. And if you want to know more about the Victorian era, tune in to like every YouTuber.
I need to find time to start watching Curiosity Stream.
That's true. Jen.
Yeah, thanks everyone for showing up and the great questions in the chat. That's great. You can pretty much just find me here on Dork Tales. I did do some streaming in the past, but then my place flooded and I've been moving around since then. So maybe one day, once again.
Nice. Christine.
Well, I'm Christine. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find me on Twitch or social medias as Lady Liliana. I stream Tuesday nights and Saturday mornings. I skip today's, of course, because we have DorkX. But I generally play Guild Wars 2, which is an MMO. Feel free to come join me and ask questions because I will just devolve into a long history or anthropology. I was trying to say anthropologic, but also anthropology discussion if you prompt me. If you give me prompts to work off of, I will not shut up. So feel free to come and join me and get me started on any of those sort of things, and I will give you all sorts of little bits and pieces. I'm more than
Yeah.
happy to talk history, and if I don't know something, I am more than happy to learn about it. So, also, I have Charlie sometimes join me on stream. So,
That's true.
big black dog alert, and you can give him
All right.
cookies.
And I've been Kelly. This is my channel. Thanks for tuning in. If you like what we did here today, go ahead and click the tip button that's in the chat right there and toss a coin to your streamer. I am very excited that we got to do this panel. This was like a little like idea that kind of sparked in my head a while ago, and I want to do it next year, maybe a little longer if we can make it, and maybe a little structure with questions about like ways to incorporate it even more, because I'm sad we talked about gender and I didn't get to bring up this little dude, this little ditty right here, which is like, yeah, the Game of Thrones role-playing
Oh
game
my.
and gender is interesting because they actually have rules in there about women in the game. They get different stats from the beginning as an optional template, but it's really cool stuff. But we'll talk more about that later. We're about to get ready to go into our costumes, or at least the costuming panel. So if you want to help the stream grow, be sure to donate below so we can buy some good art. Right now, we've got like almost $500 right now. That is fantastic. Oh, thank you so much, Traz,
thank you,
for did you round us up? Did he's round us up? I think he just rounded us up to something. Anyway, folks, that's going to be it for us. We'll be back in about 15 minutes. Don't go anywhere, and we'll see you in the costuming panel. Love you very much. Goodbye, everybody.